So our next presenter is Christopher Quintana, and it's so special to see you here tonight because I remember when we had our first conversation when you were transitioning to Cal State Fullerton, and here you are doing all sorts of amazing things. So super proud of you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. I remember the first day too, and it's nice seeing some familiar faces. Let me just begin to share my screen very quick. Can everyone see that okay? Or
looks great.
Is there stuff in the way? Okay, perfect. So thank you all and good afternoon for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Christopher Quintana, as Dr. Perez mentioned, and I'm an undergraduate communicative sciences and disorder student, so speech therapy or speech language pathology. And I'm absolutely thrilled to share with you my presentation titled The Importance of Recruitment and Retention of Minority Student Leaders and the Impact of Undergraduate Student Leadership on Professional Readiness. But okay, there we go. But before I go any further and begin to lay the groundwork and premise for my project, I do have to acknowledge two of my biggest supporters, not only during my time conducting research, but throughout my entire time at CSUF, Dr. Sung and Dr. Sines. I mean, without your unwavering support and you know, just being always there for me, I don't think I would have made it this far. So I truly appreciate you guys. And then, of course, special love and thanks to my parents, Art and Lisa, and to my brother, Nathan, who've just been so supportive throughout my entire college career. I greatly appreciate them. So this year has proven to be quite a test of resilience. Prior to March 9th, my project was looking at parental age differences and how that correlated with child language development. But luckily, the same week we were all sent home, I started a project with a friend and colleague of mine, Simone Moss, who is now a grad student at MGH in Boston. And we were looking at just how leadership and what kind of relation it has to graduate school readiness. And over the past several months, my project has kind of evolved and was able to kind of pick this up in its place. And it has a two-pronged approach. So the first half of my project looks at the systemic inequalities in the field of communication sciences and disorders. So I'm going to be referring to this as CSD throughout my presentation. It's just a broader term that encompasses speech language pathologists, audiologists, and other speech and hearing professionals. And the first half provides possible reasoning as to why the field itself is as homogeneous as it is, and it identifies ways to support minority students that are pursuing degrees in this field. And one of those factors actually being student life, which I'm going to talk about more specifically in the second half of my project, which is a qualitative look from some in-depth interviews that Simone and I conducted with some former CSD student leaders here at CSUF, and to get their personal take on leadership and how it served them professionally. But before I dive into that second half, I have to kind of set the stage and talk about this first component. So 5 to 10% of Americans may be diagnosed with the communication disorder at some point in their lifetime. And this accounts for nearly 32 million Americans needing the services of over the 211,000 CSD professionals. But how does that look when over 90% of the professionals are white and 95% are female? Less than 10% of professionals in the field actually identify as a racial or ethnic minority. And a 2013 analysis done by The Atlantic actually ranked the field as the fourth whitest profession, just behind veterinarians, ranchers, and mining operators. So in my literature review, I kind of do an analysis of the urgency to diversify the field. I take a look at the past in order to kind of understand the present, and history is something that's not often talked about in our coursework within the field. And I want to use it as a way to kind of understand the systemic barriers that have impacted the profession and how even things like the geographic location of some of the earliest CSD degree granting institutions, which were moral land grant institutions, and how those kind of paved the way for this quote unquote status quo of sameness. And the field actually grew out of the Midwest. The earliest degree granting institutions in CSD were Midwestern institutions. And to this day, nearly 40% of the top 20 graduate programs in CSD are Midwestern institutions. So I look at the legacy that that kind of create and the impact it has on the field as a whole, as well as in a way how it has created a sort of monopoly on research and some biases against testing and assessment. So also just for some quick context, in order to become a speech language pathologist, minimum education is a master's degree. And for an audiologist, it's a clinical doctorate. So you're in these institutions and you can be faced with what seems like some endless hurdles. And these hurdles can come in many different forms, whether it be financial, bureaucratic, or sometimes it's blatant racism. And it's very easy for me to spew all these facts and figures at you. So I want to try and humanize it with the actual story of Dr. Belinda Daughtry. She is a part of our larger CSU family, an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach. And she is a Spelman, UCLA, and NYU grad, and was actually only one of 3 African Americans admitted into her 60-person cohort. And in an op-ed she published earlier this year, she talks about that experience, and she talks about the weight of being, quote, the only one. And she describes an instance during her graduate experience where, despite having all A's, she was told by faculty that it would probably be in her best interest to drop out. And what I think is just absolutely disgusting is she was actually also told by faculty that she might be interested in, quote, taking a fried chicken tour of South Los Angeles. I think the behavior is just absolutely abhorrent, but these are the experiences of some people pursuing degrees in this field. And when she actually became a faculty member at Cal State Long Beach, trying to work and change the status quo and how we look at admissions and, just making it more equitable across the board. And out of the over 200 applications they received her first year on the admissions committee, 80 of them received invitations for interviews, yet not one of them was African American. And that was something that none of the other faculty even realized until Dr. Daughtry brought it up after the fact. So some really important points, and just to actually humanize this aspect. Some more stats. In a 2019 survey from the Council of Academic Programs in CSD, racial and ethnic minorities accounted for less than 1/3 of undergraduates pursuing degrees, as seen in figure 2.1, and roughly about 1/5 as seen in pursuing graduate degrees, as seen in figure 2.2. And it should also be noted that only 12% of HBCUs actually offer either degrees at the undergraduate or graduate level in CSD, and those are listed to the left. So the mentor for my project, Dr. Terry Sines, she's a child language expert, so she was perfect for my original project, but she's just equally as perfect for my new project, or my revised project. She's a true champion for diversity and inclusion within the field. And in an early 2000s report, she actually highlighted 5 factors and recommendations for CSD programs of what they can do to not only recruit underrepresented students, but how to retain them throughout their entire academic experience. And these include having not only faculty that are diverse, but making sure that recruitment and retention is actually a value that the faculty members have, which I think is kind of funny that we have to spell it out, but we actually do. Implementation of curriculum focused on cultural competency, as well as some collaborative learning projects where we can learn from each other's shared experiences, and not everything is revolved around testing and grades and all that stuff. And then the last point, which I'm going to be honing in on a lot more, and that's the creation of on-campus student organizations, and particularly of interest to me as a student leader myself. So my study took place between March and June of this year, and I was able to recruit alongside Simone 17 participants for standardized interviews and ask them about their experiences as student leaders and try and hope to gain a better understanding of them. And then the only inclusion criteria that I had for participants is that, of course, they held a leadership position in one of our CSD student organizations at CSUF, NISLA, the National Student Speech Language and Hearing Association, or STANCE, our sister chapter, which is Student Speech Therapists Nurturing Cultural Enrichment. And just a little background on my participants. The average age was about 26 years with about a decade age difference overall. Um, the majority of participants were post-baccalaureate students that held leadership positions. So just meaning they received their undergraduate degree in an unrelated field and are now taking leveling courses or prerequisites so they can apply to grad school. And then it was almost evenly split between first years or first time freshmen and then transfer students, but the majority of student leaders being those post-baccs. And also worth noting, 80% of those interviewed are current graduate students, with the remaining being either practicing clinicians now or clinical fellows. So just some more information about these highly qualified applicants and participants. When they were applying for grad school, the average number of programs they applied to were 6, which with acceptances being 3, so hovering around that 50% mark. And as undergraduates, we're told to apply to as many institutions as possible, and that not one school is a safety school. However, this process can actually shut out qualified applicants who who historically have restricted access to education, and some of these extra fees. It can be upwards of $1,000 or more to apply to grad school, just depending on how many programs you're applying to. And once you add everything up to your prep and all of that. So not only is it expensive to apply to grad school, but the cost is also exorbitant as well. When I spoke to participants, they noted finances being their #1 reason for choosing a graduate program in state. So that was one of a pivotal and determining factor of where these students actually wanted to go to grad school, finances being very important. Um, and I also do want to point out, coincidentally, ironically, but my participants are racial and ethnic backgrounds are in diametric opposition to the national averages. 15 of the 17 are identified as a racial or ethnic minority, which just had to point that out, which is different when you can go to a program somewhere else in the country and not have one person of color at all. So when asked what their primary reason for joining these student organizations were, the #1 being enhancing their resume and gaining more experience to look competitive on paper and during the graduate application process. But what I found, I guess, heartwarming and comforting is the second biggest reason being an interest in multiculturalism, that these students actually have this vested interest and want to share it with others. And then the remaining just kind of being split between expanding their professional network, gaining access to events, and just some personal growth and development there. However, when you were to ask these students why they actually sought leadership positions within the organizations, that responses were less self-serving and more altruistic. So this one person respondent told me that they wanted to contribute to a larger cultural change within the department, that when they transferred, the student body kind of felt a little bit toxic and it was very super competitive and there were a lot of cliques, which makes sense. You're competing for graduate spots, but this person, they wanted to give resources to everyone in the community. Another respondent told me that the organization matched their identity and it provided them with a safer space. And another said that they believed they believed in the organization's mission. And they wanted to, quote, spread the word in our profession of how important it is to recognize people from different backgrounds, that these are factors that actually shape how we deal with these communication disorders. And it gives a more human component to the work that we're doing. And similarly, when I asked them what kind of culture they hope to create while being in these positions of leadership, many of them, they said that they wanted to foster an environment where everybody could feel comfortable. They wanted everybody to feel like they belonged and that everybody had a voice in their culture, background, gender. Everything about them was equally important as somebody else's, and that these differences just actually bring us together instead of dividing us. So some great responses there. And I think essentially what these student leaders aim to do, just what Science pointed out in her initial research, is to not only create these student organizations, but to be vessels where students can grow personally and professionally. And interestingly, 90% of participants in the study cited their experience as student leaders as being a pivotal moment or a pivotal part of them being successful as grad students. But they did make it clear that you didn't have to be a student leader to be a successful graduate student. And they believed anybody can be a leader if given the right tools. This one respondent pointed out that it might be because of insecurities that they think that they might not be a great leader. And someone else told me that there isn't one archetype of what a leader is. And I wholeheartedly agree with those statements for sure. And really just to kind of wrap up and show you these statistics and these personal experiences, the one thing I want you to take away from these findings is how their participation in student leadership at the undergraduate level has impacted their interest of possibly pursuing a leadership role as a practicing professional once they finish grad school. And over half of participants, nearly 70%, so that they were interested in that their undergraduate leadership experience was one of the main reasons for sparking that interest. And I mean, if we're able to get more diverse leaders at the national level of ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or serving on these smaller roles at the district level or within our state associations, we'll be able to make changes in our governing and legislative and at the professional level, which is just kind of showing that we're starting at almost like a pipeline in a way, and that this is it's very important that we actually give students a chance, and we will reap the benefits later on. So that's basically everything I have. Comments, questions, concerns. I know we're gonna wrap up with that later, but thank you all so much for bearing with me and listening to me, and looking forward to hearing everyone else's presentations.
Wow, Christopher, mind-blowing information. I'm sure a lot of participants will have questions for you this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Perez.
I have a question for Christopher.
Hi.
Hey, I don't know if you went into this in your research, but I was wondering, is there a corresponding underrepresentation of children diagnosed with CSD disorders from ethnic backgrounds?
So yes is a general and very quick answer to that. A lot of it has to do with the testing and the innate biases in testing, and and the number one or the two ethnic groups that are historically diagnosed with communication disorders at disproportionate rates, being African Americans and Native Americans. But the African American group, a lot of that dealing with something which we're working towards in the field, something we refer to as difference versus disorder, where we talk about African American vernacular English. And there are, I can go on a huge tangent. I feel like this is a separate paper in itself, but the quick answer to that is yes. It's something that I talk about in my paper briefly and reference, but it wasn't like a main component. But yes, there are differences.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, I have a question for Christopher as well. Excellent presentation, by the way. Do you have any advice for honors ComD students about creating a presentation and how to connect various topics regarding diversity into a successful presentation?
Definitely. Thank you so much. So I think really diversity can be included into really any aspect of the field or any research topic that you're interested in, because it's always there. And there's a real lack of research. I don't know if you've realized that within the field. So it's so important that we have people actually going out and being either the first ones to bring these topics up, or to challenge existing theories or status quos that are already out there. To answer your question of what how to go about starting a research project within the field, I think I'd advise really think about if there's a specific disorder or a specific area of the field that you're passionate about and that you're interested in learning, and reach out to our department chair and see if they can connect you with a faculty member who has a specialty or has research background in that topic. And then also it might be worth looking into the Allied Health Academy here at Cal State Fullerton. I was a part of their program last summer and was able to actually start research on my original project looking at parental age differences in child language development. And I was able to actually receive funding from them, and they helped me with my IRB and everything. It was such a fantastic program. And that's not just for anyone in communication disorders, but really anyone in like the allied health professions, kinesiology majors and psychology majors. It was a very helpful experience, and they were able to connect you with people and research opportunities there. So I'd recommend you looking into that for maybe summer 2021.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
We have time for one more question. So if you have your burning question to ask, please mute yourself.
I'd like to ask, or maybe just make a comment for Christopher, and it's about how he makes me think about our history. The history of the United States, U.S. society, and I'm trained as a historian, so my mind goes that way. But the thing is that the land grant institutions that you listed were established by the Northern-dominated U.S. Congress in 1862 during the Civil War, and that I've just been kind of realizing this kind of thing rather recently. So the work that you've done and presented has helped me to be more informed about that. But the Civil War was being fought over slavery, the institution of slavery, and meanwhile there are these moves that the Northerners are making toward the West to consolidate their power, partly because they can do it because the South is just, they don't have to deal with the South at that point except by way of the war, right? So anyway, I don't want to go on too much about this, but there's just maybe the upshot of what I'm trying to get at is that, there are two different kinds of racism in the North and the South. And while the North did what it did during the Civil War in terms of consolidating and expanding their power and control over the territory, they remained racist in their particular way. And then, of course, the Indian Wars were going on too. So the thing is that you end up with African Americans and Native Americans continuing to have their voices quashed, or right, and then you're showing us the reflections of that that are persisting, aren't you?
No, well, definitely 100%. And I think even to that point, when you're saying voices are still being quashed, kind of going back to, I think it was Becky who asked the question about like what groups are, often overdiagnosed. And, just going back to that point, even after, Jim Crow, a lot of these communities, they were still living together. And I talk about this in the paper about how even the impact of slavery has on the specific dialect of African American English, and how that has contributed to this whole notion of difference versus disorder. And it's just the whole thing. It's just what's interesting about this field is I haven't had one class, even in the introduction, that talks about the history of our field. It's something that I don't think even a lot of people in our major like question. If we're lucky, we get a little bit about some of the speech doctors that came over from Europe and kind of started the field in a sense. But other than that, you're lucky to maybe get a paragraph or a chapter at most in some of our textbooks. So it's been difficult to try and piece this together and come up with some possible reasoning. But I'm a student in your altruism and social justice class, and I feel like that has kind of propelled me to think about this a little bit differently, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's good. It's a very sad story in a way, but what you're doing is very, very promising, and your presentation was really fantastic, and really wish you all the best as you proceed.
I appreciate that, Professor. Thank you.